You know, I was struggling with how I wanted to open today's video, so I was messing around on one of those like baby making photo apps where you take the picture of the father and the mother and you see hypothetically what type of kid they would have. So I took a photo of Don DeLillo, circa the 80s, and a picture of Cleo Birdwell, and I got... haunting, isn't it?
I can't remember which American writer it was. I heard him speak and he said that his job is to comfort the disturbed and to disturb the comfortable.
Welcome to my TED Talk, where today's topic is why writers should never procreate. No. Today, welcome to Books You Haven't Read. My name, Nate Rankin. Today, talking about Amazons by Cleo Birdwell. Now, Cleo Birdwell is actually a nom de plume for Don DeLillo, and this book may be familiar to some of you, either because you've seen my signed books video. I do technically have a signed copy. It is signed by Cleo Birdwell, which was part of the whole sort of publicity stunt that this novel was. Cleo Birdwell is sort of alternately attributed to be either Don DeLillo or Don DeLillo and Sue Buck. Who is Sue Buck? Sue Buck was a co-worker of Don DeLillo's who worked with him at Ogilvy and Mathers, and they worked there before DeLillo was a novelist that would have been the 60s, I imagine. She is chiefly responsible for kind of the background of the protagonist, namely the sort of flashback scenes to the protagonist's childhood in small-town Ohio. So this book was published in 1980, and that's an interesting hinge point in DeLillo's career, because it's right after Running Dog, which is his novel about a Hitler sex tape, and it's right before The Names, which is kind of considered to be the start of his major period by most, DeLillo scholars, DeLilliati, from The Names to about Underworld from 1982 to 1997, and the 5 books that he publishes within that time frame. That's kind of considered his major period and his best period. So this is like the last book that he kind of writes before that period. Interestingly enough, this book was actually his best-selling book until White Noise, which won the National Book Award of 1985. He had published either 7 or 8. I think this was his 8th novel. I looked it up. It was actually his 7th. And he had done that all in about 10 years. Americana came out in 1971. I think he had been working on it for, I want to say, 5 years. And then after that, it was like a spitfire of novels after that, basically. And he was very prolific and very productive of the 1970s. But he's also fairly critical and kind of brushes off that period in his life within the, actual interviews that he gives. They made about 25,000 copies of this book, and it sold about 17,000, which made it DeLillo's best-selling novel until White Noise, which won the National Book Award in 1985. So initially, DeLillo brought this book to his publisher Knopf, and they refused it, so that allowed him to shop it around with other publishers. A Canadian imprint of Penguin Random House picked it up, and they had kind of the idea to, let's make this like an actual sort of publicity stunt, because the subtitle is An Intimate Memoir by the First Woman Ever to Play in the National Hockey League. So they hired this woman, the mother of DonCleo deBirdwell, that we saw in the cold open. They had her attend book events and conventions, and she would, answer questions, apparently, and signed a bunch of books, which is where kind of my copy originates from. Ever since the paperback edition of this book came out, DeLillo has refused permission to reprint it, and he's refused to kind of even associate his name. In fact, he only acknowledged his authorship, incidentally, of this book in an interview around this time last year for, he was doing promotion for his latest book, The Silence, not a good book. The question that got him to acknowledge it was about a character in this book named Murray J. Siskind, and Murray J. Siskind is one of the minor characters in White Noise and is a sports writer in this book. There was speculation at the time that Don DeLillo wrote this novel because forget who, but one of the reviewers basically said, yeah, this has all the markings and this has the voice of Don DeLillo. And of course, Murray J. Siskin showing up in White Noise was all but confirmation. Still, though, DeLillo has largely kind of kept his distance from this novel, and for that reason, it's a bit rarer, but it's kind of a goofy, rare book. In high school, about 50% of what I read were these kind of sports memoirs, right? And like most things you read in high school, it does depend on, very formulaic kind of genre conventions. One of these conventions is that you're not just seeing these continuous, athletic feats, but you're also seeing kind of this arc of moral character, right? The athlete's not just telling you, here are all my successes, but they are often telling you kind of how they have grown and matured and become more wise. Another convention or another structure that the sports memoir depends on is that it usually depends on like a lifelong arc. You get really distinct stages in life, usually childhood, high school athletics, college athletics, and then pros. This book kind of bucks both of those conventions. It's very consciously counter to that. The book primarily takes place over about, I want to say maybe a 6-month period, and even then about half of the book takes place over roughly like a 2-week road trip. It's not to say that there aren't flashbacks to primarily her childhood in small town Ohio and, a couple mentions of like her minor league career, but by and large, it's just a snapshot of this year. And it also kind of countervails the typical building of moral character, because I would define this book, or I would describe this book as a very amoral book. Not immoral, but amoral. As though the contrivances of traditional morality are too exhausting to deal with for these hyper-modern characters. In a lot of ways, I would almost say that it's a mix of hyper-modern characters and very juvenile characters, because that's probably more accurate as to what athletes are actually like, is that they're really a bunch of overgrown kids that are just hyper talented physically. The main feature of this book are the sexual escapades, or probably better to say the sexual misadventures of the protagonist. This book could easily be thought of as a satire of sex, and a lot of that sex is stripped of its eroticism, and then its sort of hilarity is heightened to a maximum degree. The sense that I kind of got from it was, okay, written in 1980, a lot of the characters are maybe dealing with almost like a post-sexual revolution exhaustion. And for the guys, it's almost an affliction or a deeply weird neuroses. But they have this exhaustion of being unable to stop wanting it. And Cleo, as kind of the only woman in the orbit of their lives, especially once they go on this road trip, becomes this just greater and greater focus for all these different men. Cleo is a very sex-positive character that is neither cynical nor romantic. In many ways, she's really just looking for like one normal lay with a guy that doesn't have an insane sexual neurosis, but that kind of proves to be impossible. She has, I believe, 7 partners throughout this book, and there is kind of ostensibly a boyfriend figure, or at least they make initial moves that are kind of relationship-y, but for most of the book, this character is actually in hibernation. His name's Shaver, and he has Frenchman's jumping disease, which is a real disease, apparently, and it's like an involuntary twitch disease, and it manifests in a variety of different ways. They go to a conference about it, and sort of the solution that he has is that he needs to go into hibernation, into this like pod-like object. It's called, I love this name, it's called the Kramer Cube. Again, like 10 years before Seinfeld, this book is. And so he is off stage for most of the novel, and that frees her up to, kind of go about sexual escapades / misadventures. The sex cuts across sort of typically otherwise professional boundaries, whether that's with journalists or front office people or coaches, etc. There are sort of like hints at or like gestures toward feeling guilty that she's, ostensibly cheating on Shaver, even though they aren't really a thing. And so it's just a very confused, purposefully so, a confused sort of romantic book in which there really isn't like all that much possibility for romance. To give you a sampling of what some of these sexual neuroses for these guys are like, you've got a guy who, the coach, who at first just needs to speak to someone in French. Cleo doesn't understand French, but he just needs someone to speak French to. He's French Canadian, and that becomes this like very sexually charged thing for him. It builds up, and eventually they fuck. There's another guy that cannot perform if he hears mention of the Watergate scandal, the Richard Nixon Watergate scandal. Once he hears mention of Watergate, he feels completely emasculated. And then there's another character that wants to be told sort of these innocent and wholesome stories of Cleo's childhood, particularly around about Christmas time in the small town that she's from. The men all come off as fairly to grossly pathetic figures. The relationship that Cleo has with them, I would say, is almost more akin to like a caretaker or a nurse. You know, she is like, the sex is half intercourse and also half quelling just these odd maladies that these men have. This necessarily puts her in a powerful position, or a position of relative power, or just a position of relative sanity and stability. Again, the book is called Amazons, so it's invoking that powerful, mythical, sexualized female figure, and it's suborning the men who would otherwise be kind of the dominant figures in sexual relationships. In terms of like other DeLillo novels, it's hard to find like a good one-to-one comparison. One of the books it reminds me of is Ratner's Star because of kind of structure and world. Cleo is sort of made to go through this wonderland of sexual neurotics. You might also think of this as like a feminist Menippean satire of the 1980s sports world. Incidentally, the sports are almost entirely incidental to the plot of this book. The reason that she is initially brought up to the New York Rangers, I haven't even named the team yet. She plays for the New York Rangers. Reason she's originally brought up is because their team sucks and is in the basement. And then at one point they kind of go on this inexplicable winning streak. And they end up competing for a playoff spot. But again, it's very incidental to the plot overall. The other book that it reminds me of is White Noise because of those like hyper modern sensibilities in this sort of very hilarious fusion of mysticism and consumerism. I want to read a couple of passages that kind of exemplify this hyper-modern hilarity. This first passage comes from page 129 to 130. Glenway was probably 52 years old. I didn't know for sure whether he was gay, straight, or what. A lot of men are just so gracious and urbane and impeccably turned out and physically glossy and have such a fatigued, drawling, high-strung kind of wit and such beautiful manners that a little neon tube goes on in your head and you think, nobody like this can possibly be straight because only homosexual men take such time and care with their clothes and appearance and lavish such attention on their overall bodies and have such a glossy, high-strung style about them, whether it's a shaved head or a cigarette lighter that belongs in some Swedish crafts exhibit, and then you find out it's a Wall Street heterosexual you've been talking to all this time, and you wonder what's wrong with him, being so well-mannered and urbane and handsomely turned out. So that's just one example of Cleo sort of navigating her way through, one of these men and their particular oddities. She has a kind of caustic analysis about his sexuality that I think you'll agree is pretty funny. We actually find out later that this guy has only had shall we say, manual sex for the last 30 years and has not had genital sex. So that's like, it keeps accelerating with weirdness with this guy. The second reading comes from page 257. Cleo, you're bruising the arugula. Kindly let it rest in the bowl of water. When I'm finished here, we'll dry it in a special bath towel I use for drying the more delicate salad greens. Can I do it? Of course. How do I do it? Arugula is fragile. It has to be rocked back and forth very, very gently in a fluffy bath towel. Watercress, endive, bib, or Boston lettuce I spin dry in my Swiss roti green dryer. Iceberg, we don't even talk about. Coarse and noisy. This one is kind of the quintessential DeLillo deadpan humor that encompasses that fusion of consumerism and ritual or mysticism that comes to full maturity in White Noise. But you could just as easily, I feel like, believe that this came from like Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop instructions on how to prepare salad. Now, did I like the book? Yes, but is my reaction, right? I liked constituent parts of it. I liked characters. I liked the humor in it. The book really feels in a lot of ways like kind of a cavalcade of sketches of set pieces that are just really funny. Kind of mentioned, the plot is really incidental. And so there were spots where I kind of stagnated and slowed down, but overall, like, yeah, I liked it. On Goodreads, I gave it a 3-star. I would say like my true rating of it is somewhere between like a 3.4 and 3.6. I could see myself giving it 4 stars, but I think I just got to sit on it longer, to be honest. One of the things that I'm trying not to sort of let interfere in my rating of this is that I have a great appreciation for the object that the book is itself, right? The actual copy that I have, that is, 1, a gift from my parents, 2, is, a very quirky book that is rare by an author and that also has kind of that unique signature behind it. I think last year I would have given this 4 stars, but I've read, I've had a pretty good reading year this year, so I kind of based part of my rating on the fact that I had read so much other good stuff that I don't think this was comparable to a lot of the other 4-star stuff that I read this year. Now, is it worth it to buy? Probably not. I mean, the cheapest I've seen, today as I'm making this video is that it's about like $50 just for a soft cover. However, I have seen soft covers go for 20 or right under. They don't last long, so you gotta, kind of set up an alert on your favorite book sites. I would say if you can snag it under like $20, becomes a lot more worth it. But unless you're, a quirky, weird book collector, or you're just a DeLillo completionist like I am, it's probably not worth it. It's like you're not missing that much, but it's fun. But you're not missing that much, but it's fun. Anyway, those are my thoughts on it. Kind of convoluted at the end. Thank you for watching all the way through. If you've made it this far, please shower me with your affection and likes and subscriptions and etceteras. And man, how to end today's video.
They also cut my foreskin off, which wasn't necessary.
Perfect.